Let me just welcome everyone to this forum discussion, and to say that the global outcry over the killing of George Floyd has been unprecedented, and we've seen unprecedented protest and outrage, and that's been expressed all over the world, as we've seen. And the diversity of people protesting marked what could be seen as a tipping point in the fight for racial justice, but only time will tell. There's been a wave of local, regional, and national conversations and forums, and with people calling for change. And we've had a number of conversations here. In the last conversation that featured leaders in the USA, we were delighted to pull Joel in, just like we pulled Ronald Nathan in, Pastor Nathan. And in the conversation that featured a prominent leader in the USA, Joel, a British theologian and an evangelical thought leader, challenged us to think about harnessing the global consciousness that has arisen out of the killing of George Floyd in the fight for racial justice in the USA and around the world. And therefore, we have put together a panel, and that really stimulated us to put together a panel of thought leaders and scholars to take part in a global forum on racial justice, equality, and violence. And the objective of this discussion is to stimulate kind of sort of international sort of fertilization and ideas, and we don't want to necessarily burden it with the fact that it may lead to something. Hopefully it will lead to something international, but we are, a term that Joel used that really got me thinking was the global consciousness about this. When things happen, how can we galvanize that global consciousness? And so this discussion is primarily about how can we galvanize a global conscious movement when things happen in different parts of the world, that we can kind of harness justice, thought leaders, activists to share in the participation of that. And Dawn, if you could still try, and if I can just interrupt, we still need to post it online. I think a lot of people are trying to access it. Let me make you a host again and see if you can go to the more column and see if you can, let's see here. I think a lot of people will try to, bear with me 1 second. Okay, make host. Okay, Dawn, see if you can, tell them to wait, it says question and answer, go to the more, if you can see that, and try to get a link and post it on my Facebook post page, if you can. You wrestle with that. So we have some great panelists here, and I'm so excited for this conversation. And I'm going to just read just a little bio from each one of you, if you can bear with me. First, we have, and listen, if I butcher your name, please forgive me, okay? And we have Frank, Pastor Frank Chikani. Frank, are you there? Amen. And he's an author and an eminent public speaker and a leading contributor during the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. Having survived numerous attempts on his life, he has also led the South African Council of Churches and has been a significant leader and influencer in the apostolic faith mission. Now, his bio is as long as I am tall, so there's a lot more to say about that. We also have, and again, forgive me if I do a bad job of pronouncing your name, we have Reverend Tamsin Kariapa. Is that right? Where is she? How did I do?
Yes. Good, Kariapa. Good.
Kariapa. Oh, Kariapa. And again, you know, help me with these terminologies. And you're the Minita can you state exactly what your role is? You're the
a minita iwi in our church. Basically, a minister for the people. So I'm a deacon in the Anglican Church in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And you cover both New Zealand and the Polynesia. And
our church province does, yes.
Right,
but I'm involved primarily with Te Pēopatanga o Aotearoa, which is the Māori arm of the Anglican Church here. And
you are very welcome to this conversation. We also have Dawn Lewingson with us. She's the Director of Diversity Inspired Solution and Limited, and a diversity and inclusion specialist working in the corporate space for over 15 years, following on from her work as a lecturer in law, in further education and higher education. Dawn has provided tailored learning in areas such as bias reduction, inclusive leadership, and inclusive teams to a wide range of organizations in both the UK, Europe, and as far afield as Sydney, Australia. Welcome, Dawn. And she's also going to be a part of the panelists and also helping with the technical stuff and fielding questions. We are delighted to also have Dr. Angela Herbert, MBE, and she's an eminent public speaker, published author, director of Inside Out Transformational Coaching Solutions. Angela provides bespoke services designed to assist individuals and organizations to enhance their professional and personal potential. The organization provides organizational solutions in leadership, diversity, inclusion, and change management. Dr. Herbert is also the chair of the Violent Crime Prevention Board. Thank you so much. We have with us Reverend Mark Sturge, former head of the, and if I get your details wrong, just correct me, former head of England at Christian Aid. Is an author, speaker, and experienced service manager and leader with a demonstrated history of working in charity sector, fundraising, and international development. He's also served as a leader of ASIA, and an organization that we were involved in for many years in the UK. Mark has a strong professional skills in governance, development, operational management, and strategic planning. He's also a mentor and coach to senior leaders and the executive team. Welcome, Mark. We have with us, and someone to blame for this conversation, really, is Reverend Dr. Canon Joel Edwards. So he's now moving with the big guns, as it were. That was my attempt at dry humor. There you go. Most of my jokes fall flat in America, but I expect some of you guys in Britain to give me a break. Anyway, he's also a freelance broadcaster with the BBC, a writer and international speaker on a wide range of areas, including Bible teaching, issues of justice, leadership, faith response to human rights, religious freedom, and current affairs. Joel's wide range of experience includes 12 years as probation officer, pastoral responsibilities, 11 years as the general director of ASIA, the Evangelical Alliance, in the UK, and 10 years leadership of Micro Challenge International, and a global faith-based response to extreme poverty through the Millennium Development Goals. In addition, he has served on a number of government bodies, including the Commissioner on the Equality and Human Rights Commission UK, the Advisory Board on Human Rights and the Religious Freedom with the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the Metropolitan Police Independent Advisory Group. Currently, he is an honorary canon at St. Paul's Cathedral and vice president of Barnardo's, and an advisory member on faith at the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, and a visiting fellow at Spurgeon College. We have with us also a dear friend and former colleague of mine, Reverend Dr. Antipas Harris. And I don't know, Dawn, if you can kind of toddle onto each photo so people can see them. So it comes up on the picture, and so they can see what I'm talking about. Dr. Harris, Dr. L. Harris holds a dual appointment as President Dean of the Jake Divinity School, the T.D. Jakes Divinity School, and associate pastor at the Potter's House, both located in Dallas, Texas. Dr. Harris is a public theologian, writer, and a pastor. And Dr. Harris is advancing the vision of Bishop Jakes and Chancellor T.D. Jakes, founder of the fully accredited online seminary, responding to the growing need for cutting-edge ecclesial leadership that transcends denominational lines. Harris's mandate is to prepare today's leaders for tomorrow's church. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you.
We have with us, and this is the global conversation, so you can't say all the way from anywhere. We're all close and we're all near and we're all far away. With Dr. Laporta. Dr. Laporta played a significant role in the unification of AFM, first as the catalyst between the former Anglican and former African, colored and Indian sector, and later between the composite blacks and single white sectors of the AFM. He was a National Executive Council member of the South African Council of Churches, the chairman of the Evangelical Association of South Africa, and a member of the International Dialogue between Roman Catholics and Pentecostals. Currently, I'm very interested in that. And I assume you might know Verley Clark-Hanan. I don't know if you know him, but I understand he was involved somewhere in that anyway. Currently, he's a member of the joint consultative group that consists of Pentecostals globally. And there's a lot more I could say about Dr. Laporta, but you are welcome, my friend. We're glad to have you.
Thank you very much.
We have with us Dr. Dwight Hopkins. Dr. Hopkins is the Alexander Campbell Professor of Theology at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He's a prolific writer and a scholar. Professor Hopkins initiated, amongst many things he has done, and initiated and managed a 14-country network to think about the practices of building healthy communities and healthy individual communities, with representatives from Hawaii, Fiji, Australia, Japan, India, England, Ghana, Zimbabwe, Botswana, South Africa, and Cuba, Jamaica, Brazil, and the USA. I think there was a book that came out of that. Was there or not? Okay, yes. And you can tell us about that. The network forged learning about neighbors through neighbors sharing their cultures, and indeed in international transactions of business, politics, religion. One of the greatest challenges is a lack of cultural understanding. And there's a lot more I could say about Dr. Hopkins, but you're welcome. We have with us also Dr. Albert Esanko.
Sando.
Oh no, Dr. Albert Esando. That's right.
Yes.
I should know because I spent so much years in Ghana. So, and he's a businessman at heart. He's a theologian. He's a business management and organizational leader and consultant, adjunct professor and minister, CEO of ESACO, that's what threw me off, Global Consultants, and president of Divine Mandate Ministries and Life Strategies International, and a lot more other things he's involved with. Now, I'm not sure if we have with us yet Dr. Van Gaten. Is he here?
Yes.
Dr. Van Gaten, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, my friend, how are you?
I'm excellent, my brother.
Another one of my dear friends and interlocutors, Dr. Van Gaten, pastor, professor of theology, lecturer at universities such as Harvard, Maryland, and many other, Penn State, and he's an adjunct professor of religion at Buffalo State. He's a chaplain for Federal Bureau of Prisons. He travels the world holding seminars for third world pastors, was a board of director and member of the Institute of Religion of Public Policy, a member of the Society of Pentecostal Studies, the Society of Biblical Literature, and the Society of Evangelical and Armenians. And right now you are serving as the dean for, what's the school again?
The Williams Bible Institute and Seminary in Jacksonville, Florida.
Well, amen, you're welcome. And we also have, last but by no means least, we have with us Reverend Dr. Ronald Nathan. And you're the one, you remember this, that got me into Marcus Garvey. I'm into Marcus Garvey in a big way. You're the one that really made me become a researcher. I'm currently writing a book on Garvey as well. Just tell us, I know that you're a pastor in the AME Zion Church in Barbados. Anything else you want to tell the audience?
Just that I've been able to serve the church and serve our world through being at ASIA in the United Kingdom. I was a missionary in Kenya, in East Africa. I spend most of my time shared between Africa and the Caribbean, and looking forward very much to participating and really bringing a local pastoral critique of much that we see and much that we hear within the church. I find myself pastoring churches that don't have Pentecostal in its name, but most of my members are Pentecostal by experience. So that might also be a good point of departure in one of our conversations.
Right.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And just to say that one of my many hats is I serve as the president for the Alliance for Black Pentecostal Scholars and Scholarship, and as well as many other things. I also serve as a pastor of New Beginnings Church here in California. But let's get started. And I'm going to ask you a number of questions, and feel free to sort of have cross-fertilization conversation. But we do want to get hold of this idea of how can we harness a global conscious movement. And I'm going to begin with Dr. Joel Edwards. And this forum was stirred by, and this is to Dr. Edwards, this forum was stirred by your comments about harnessing the global consciousness in the fight against racism and racial violence. Please share with us your thoughts on the effectiveness of international bodies such as the UN with the Declaration of Human Rights, the WCC with the Commission on Racial Justice, and many other international organizations in stemming the spread of racism and racial violence around the world. So that's one. And also share with us, what have you learned from your work with international organizations such as the Evangelical Alliance and Micah Challenge in bringing about an international force for equality, justice, and the common good? And I'm also interested, I know that you've been in a season of thinking, and we got a sense of that. So I'm going to just allow you just to open the conversation and address these questions as we move forward. Thank you. I hope he's not frozen.
Okay. Can you hear me okay, everybody?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you now.
Okay, because my mic was giving problems earlier. Thank you very much. I feel very privileged having the opportunity to sort of kick off the conversation. I'm also happy to have been the individual who provoked a rather more international discussion around these issues. Now, having made my claim to those 2 points, don't think that gives me any extra responsibility to be the font of all knowledge on these big issues. And therefore I see my role here as perhaps just laying the foundation for the conversation, which all of us will participating from our various points of experience and expertise. So my journey has taken me, as you mentioned in my bio, across the sort of evangelical wider community, elements of human rights. And I always regard myself, as something of a, I don't want to be one particular of these disciplines. But what I have been drawn by and drawn to during these last 3 weeks is not so much the conversations and the rhetoric which we have been having amongst ourselves in the US and elsewhere, but actually what we are seeing. What are the things which we are seeing which have made very profound impacts on our thinking? And therefore, what are we seeing which is new, which could give us the hope of being more effectual, more effective, and more transformational for the future? I think that's where my personal reflections are taking place at the moment. So when one looks across the canopy of some of the international organizations you have just mentioned, the United Nations, the World Evangelical Alliance, which represents about 600 million Christians, and one sees and hears what is coming back, I think of two things. One is, I'm very happy that elements, for example, of the World Evangelical Alliance has been sensitive to put out the right statements. What the World Evangelical Alliance has done actually is to kind of subcontract its voice to the National Assembly, a National Association of Evangelicals in the US. And if one visits their website, it's very helpful to see that they have come out and made some strident statements and have very good commitments to Black Lives Matter, very fresh commitments to issues of justice and challenging and racism and dealing with issues of inequalities. And I think that's really good. The rhetoric is great. We've all been kicked up the rear end by the events of the last 3 weeks. So it's not surprising that we have elements of the world evangelical community who have made helpful initial responses. I think I wouldn't put it more than that at the present time. I've been equally impressed by the activities from the World Council of Churches, the WCC, and people like Frank and others will be able to speak much more authoritative on what they're doing. But one of the good things about the World Council of Churches, which has put out a really helpful statement, I Can't Breathe, from the Council of World Missions, is that not only has the World Council of Churches been at this agenda for a very long time, but I think provides the kind of mechanisms, a kind of machinery, which if we leverage it rightly, should be able to take us forward for the long term. The great thing about organizations like the WCC is that even though they're broad, they're very consensual, they move right across constituencies, across the entire Christian community, and they take longer to do things. The thing is, when they emerge with responses, they emerge with consensus. And I think that's an important thing for us to bear in mind if we are indeed thinking of an international and sustainable response to the immediacy of the last 3 weeks. Of course, the big player beyond the life of the church is our organizations like the United Nations. And certainly coming out of the Human Rights Council last Wednesday, we had the brother of George Floyd, who gave a very powerful and passionate request to the UN and the Human Rights Council to actually make a response. Not in a vague way, and this is interesting to me, but he has basically challenged the Human Rights Council, which meets twice a year, very occasionally has special meetings. This was a special meeting which it convened on Wednesday. And he's challenged the council to do something about holding the American government and institutions accountable for issues of racial injustice. They have a wider canvas. They're talking about these issues across the world, but it also wants to put a finger on the US and say, we want the Human Rights Council to hold the US government accountable for its behavior in issues of racial inequality and injustices. That's a very interesting thing. What is even more interesting to me was that the ambassador for the US was not a part of that discussion. And therefore, because the US came out of the council 2 years ago, so it's going to be very interesting, therefore, to see how we leverage the work of practitioners, like some of our colleagues on the panel this evening, practitioners around the world, people listening in to this debate, and ensure that we try to find the levers by which grassroots activity and energy and expertise and passion and concerns and stories are actually delivered at the table of those who will make long-term decisions, how we hold the reform processes in the US to account from a global community. What are the lessons we have learned? Frank Chikane might be able to help us, the kind of Mandela story. What are the lessons which might be carried forward in a global community, holding itself accountable in its various parts around the world, but also how we happen to hold the US accountable for the issues of racial inequality, which has actually galvanized the whole world into the current place we find ourselves. And I think that's going to be a very important discussion, particularly as we enter a presidential election in its final stages between now and November, and how we hold not just the leader of the US to account, but how we work internationally within our nations, within our churches, and that's also quite an important element here, especially for us as Pentecostals. But how do we gather and gang up on America particularly, because America, I think, carries some particularly influential responsibilities on a number of levels. So for me, that's a kind of interesting framework for the discussion, and actually to take the heat and the energy of these last 3 weeks into what could be transcribed into sustainable, effective responses to racism and racial inequality around the world.
Thank you so much. I'm going to draw in, you mentioned Frank Chikane. So let me just draw you in, Frank, and if you could just respond to some of the things that Joel has been saying, but also tell us about your current work and the things that you're doing. And I've been fascinated to see, knowing your story, right, in South Africa, when you see what's happening in America, how do you reflect? And if you had to give advice or suggestions, what would they be in terms of, and this is what this is about, how can we learn from the South African story? So tell us about your role, and just kind of piggyback on some of the comments that Dr. Edwards has mentioned.
Yeah, of course, I mean, if I started talking about the role, it will take us, it will take the evening. But let me just say that somehow South Africa became a microcosm of the cosmic reality. If you wanted to understand what racism was about, you needed to come to South Africa to understand that. If you want to know about inequalities, you come to South Africa, you get that. So we found out that our struggle in South Africa can never be wholly achieved unless the rest of the world changes. That's what we learned during our experience. We have a better chance because, you know, the white community, it's a minority rather than a majority. Better chance to change the game. But if the world game has not changed, it will not make any difference whatsoever. And so we have an opportunity. I must say that the George Floyd moment, it's God sent, basically. I mean, God tends to change tragedies into opportunities for us to find solutions in the world. For the first time, the world has stopped and thought about racism in a special way. It has stopped to think about people of African descent in a way that it has never thought of it. And it denies it. And so before I come to the issues that our colleagues referred to at a global level, I thought about this. I want to say three things. You see, there are two things that must be acknowledged. If we don't get that acknowledged, we will not be able to achieve our objectives, actually. So the first for me is that there must be an acknowledgement by the descendants of those who enslaved Africans, acknowledge the brutality of that slavery experience and the dehumanization of racial discrimination that followed after that. Of course, there was colonization and other things that followed. You see, if you don't have an acknowledgement, you can't solve the problem. And the best example, Dr. Laporta will know what I'm talking about, but the best example is the president of the white section of our church, Dr. Isaac Berger, who during the time I was tortured, detained, poisoned, he never believed it happened. He never believed it. Until after 96, we united, and until the police and the minister of police and went to do a confession in court about how they poisoned me. It's only then that he came to me and said, you know, I'm very sorry. I couldn't believe it. I didn't believe my people could do such a thing. And I think if there is no acknowledgement, you can't deal with the problem. And so we need the world to acknowledge that experience of slavery, 400 years, of the past 400 years, slavery, colonization, dehumanization, racial discrimination, it's critical. The second thing that needs to be acknowledged, it's the impact of this experience, because it had enormous impact. And then it affected people economically. If you are oppressed, if you are dehumanized, if you are discriminated against, you lose in the game. And so people are poor. So poverty then gets associated with Africans or, you know, those types of experiences. And so we need to admit that. We need to accept that if there is no change, and that's my submission. My submission is that if there's no change economically, we can make as many statements as we like. But if the conditions of the people of African descent doesn't change in the world, it doesn't matter what you do, there will still be elements of racism that survives. And so, having said that, because for me that's the fundamentals, in South Africa, we will not defeat racism as long as if the majority of Black people in this country remain living in abject poverty. We will not defeat it. We need to change those conditions. And I would like then to end by referring to this global experience, because in a sense, in South Africa, we went through all these experiences, and I don't need to spend too much time on it. We are still deep in the struggle to defeat racism. We have not done it. The strategies for me, it's collective actions by people of African descent globally. As you might know, the African Union, which was established during the time, reconstituted during the time I was in government with President Mbeki, introduced a clause that declares people of African descent in the diaspora as the sixth region of the African Union. And when you read that article, you get it clear that they think of people of African descent coming together, dealing with not just racism, but the economic challenges we are facing. And I'm hoping that with the UN declaring the decade 2015-2024 as a decade, international decade for people of African descent, it's a recognition at the UN level that there is a special problem we need to deal with. And they summarize it in the theme as people of African descent: recognition, justice, development. Now, I would have gone a little bit further than that, but that's what they have. But it's a moment that we need to take hold of and get the UN to do what it is supposed to be doing and do it effectively before 2024, because they're going to go past if we don't make sure that at least we've got a handle. They've got a proclamation. We must use that. And then the last thing I would like to say is that at the World Council of Churches level, I go in there as moderator of the Churches Commission on International Affairs, and I've been attending those meetings since 2016. The people of African descent, Africans and Africans in the diaspora, meet always at the fringes of the WCC to say it's one thing to talk about just what do you change in the WCC, and the WCC has changed quite a lot since 1948. But there's something more than that. The global reality negates our humanity. And so we engaged each other, went to the All Africa Conference of Churches in Kigali to deal with this matter together. And we agreed that we need to have a follow-up on the Manchester Conference. That's where I want to end up. In the Manchester Conference in 1945 is the one that after this Second World War, by the way, First World War, people of African descent were drawn into the war. After the war, they treated them like less than human beings. The conference of, in France after First World War, people of African descent thought they're going to be free. They were fighting for freedom, and they never got it. After Second World War, the same. And that's why that conference was held, and it gave birth to the decolonization process after that. So we have agreed that we should mobilize Africans on the continent and on the diaspora to work together towards a conference next year, not of just delivering papers, but on what actions are we going to take to make a difference. And so I'm trying to sum up the global and the national in the same package. But this is, I'm convinced the George Floyd moment has created a dynamic that gives us an opportunity to cause the change to happen.
Thank you so much. Now, I was interested in the two things you mentioned, which was, first of all, we have to acknowledge that it happened, slavery and Jim Crow and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And then you talked about recognizing the economic impact. Now, with the South African Truth and Reconciliation, people might say those two things happen, or maybe they didn't happen, or did it happen? But still the economic disparities in South Africa is still there, right? Maybe that's going to take time. But I wanted to pull in Dr. Hopkins. As you listen to that, Dwight Hopkins, how would you respond to that? And just tell us, because I know that this is something you've been thinking through. You've also been working globally, where a lot of people were having sort of talks of race and justice and black theology. You really were one of the few people I know that took this conversation globally, and not just by having a conversation, by a sustained project. Can you just respond to what Dr. Kachini said, and also tell us about your work as an international scholar and the current American dilemma in this issue of race and racial inequality?
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to participate in such a distinguished panel. I see a couple of old friends who are still on the path. One of the things I've tried to do historically and even today is to link my global practices and thought around concrete local issues. And so I can talk more about my experiences here in Chicago and the South Side of Chicago. I think the issue of Mr. George Floyd has a long history, and it's going to be repeated again. As we know, Mr. Harris in Atlanta happened just last week. And there's going to be another one 2 weeks from now. There's going to be another one next month. We had Rodney King in LA in 1992. So I think it's a profound tragedy about what's happening. And people are losing husbands and wives, and also Black women. We can't forget Breonna Taylor as well. It's a deep tragedy, but it has a long history since Black people came. Africans were brought to the United States, English-speaking colonies in 1619, and I teach a course on Africa and African diaspora in the U.S. And it's averaging probably every 12 months since 1619. Somebody's killed by an administrator that's officially either the law enforcement or representing law enforcement. So there's going to be another one next week. There'll be another one next month. So what gives me energy is just the local. And a lot of the people I relate to are Black folk who've never even, guys whose grandfathers, they've never even been to downtown Chicago, except to maybe pay a bill. So, I mean, there are a lot of those guys. Again, I can't speak for everybody who's of African descent in Chicagoland, but a lot of those guys are concerned about jobs. I think the economic piece is critical. I think, Frank, the second point is so key. The unemployment piece, the job piece, Black business piece, very important to some of those guys, a lot of those guys. In Chicago, every weekend we have 15 to 40 shootings. And I've been here since 1995. So those guys there, they're concerned about their neighborhoods. They're concerned about their kids and their grandkids in that sense. So the question of education, the previous mayor closed like 30 schools, public schools on the south side of Chicago and the west side of Chicago. So what happens to the kids in terms of education? Chicago is known as one of the areas of the south side of food deserts. So people get there, I've seen kids going to school in the morning, they're eating Lay's potato chips, that's their breakfast. And unfortunately, some of those places were burned down, not all. So, but where are those kids going to get their Lay's potato chip breakfast? So to me, this is just, again, it's a microcosm, it's a small part, but those are the things that are on my heart, because I've been, working with these brothers since 1998. And it's an all men's group that's part of it's called a church cell group. So it's everybody's Christian, love the Lord, and, looking for a here and hereafter. So these are brothers they're all guys. So they started in 1985 trying to do stuff, and I joined in 1998. So those are some of the issues that excite me. The good news is these are Black men who are, they're strong family guys, grandfathers who they've been on the path, volunteer, sacrifice, love the church, love the Lord, and they love, taking care of the young folk of the new generation. So I think whatever happens, again, I'm only speaking from the U.S. side. I'm only speaking from a small section of South Side Chicago. I can't speak for a lot of other folk. But I think their issues might be symptomatic for a lot of the folk who aren't on television, who's not on cable news, who don't get to fly to represent Black people across the country to different conferences. So that's one thing. The other thing too is there's corporations on Wall Street and Silicon Valley, as of this past weekend, have pledged and committed a little less than $3 billion USD for a quote, Black Lives Matter. My concern is who's going to get that $3 billion? Who's going to get that $3 billion? We have to know that after the Civil Rights Movement, two things happened. We had a huge increase of the Black professional class, and I'm part of that. We have, I mean, I could give you the list of the number of black billionaires, the number of black 100 millionaires, the number of black multimillionaires, the number of black millionaires. So that was, but at the same time, the second thing that happened was that there was an increase in poverty on an economic scale for a lot of the people that, at least in my small circle, we're concerned about. The good news is that there are people who aren't in the headlines. There are people we will never see who are day to day holding it together and struggling. And somehow if we could link those folk to the global Africa diaspora movement, that to me would be a beautiful thing. That would be a foretaste of heaven to come. If we could get those folk, you know, if we could get on the U.S. side and get them involved. And that voice, it may not be as smooth and as articulate. They may not know the language of globalization, you know, which I teach, I participated, but they would have a lot to contribute. So my heart is very warmed when I think about those guys and, you know, the families are there. And also that it seems to me that there's a very positive energy on this Zoom thing here where maybe something can be birthed out of it. So I hope that we can bring those guys and gals to the larger conversation, whatever results of this. And I'm glad happy to be part of this.
Thank you so much. I want to pull in Reverend Kuriapa, and I want you to just jump in at this point as we're looking at sort of local realities and just share with us about your service and your work as a Christian minister in the Anglican Church in your area. And what are some of the challenges that they face along race and racial violence? And I'll be interested to see, when you see what's happening, what kind of resonance do you see and how does that sort of help or not?
Kia ora, Clifton. I te tuitahi e mihi ana ki a koe, te rangatira I Clifton. Te kai whakahaere I tēnei rā koutou ko ngā kai kōrero o tēnei hui. Ka huri a hau ki te mihi ki te whānau George Floyd, koutou ko ngā whānau katoa tangi ana ki o koutou matinga. E rere ana ngā roi mata ko tōku whānau, ko tōku iwi o Aotearoa whānui I tēnei wā tūkino I tēnei wā pauri. He nui a mātou aroha ki a koutou. Tēnā koutou katoa. It is an honor and a privilege to be with you all today. The recent killing of George Floyd sent shockwaves through all of us here in Aotearoa. The despair, the outrage, the disbelief has been felt and continues to be felt by myself and my brothers and sisters here in Aotearoa. We were shocked, but to be honest, as it's been said already, racism, this sort of treatment, oppression, injustice and violence has been going on, as we all know, for centuries. So while we mourn, while we are disgusted and brokenhearted, we realize that this incident is not at all uncommon, will be repeated again, and a symptom of a system that has been kneeling on our necks for centuries. So to the question posed to me about resonances in my own context with people of African descent, of course I answer yes, because it's all related, right? The continued oppression of people of African descent and of my own Indigenous Māori people and Indigenous people globally comes from the same root. While our contexts differ, of course, it is one and the same oppressive colonial imperialistic system that perpetuates systematic and systemic racism in our societies and institutions, in our justice systems, education and health systems, and in the highest decision-making bodies of our countries. In New Zealand and Australia, therefore, Indigenous Māori and Aboriginal peoples, along with many others, have been involved in marches and protests, standing in solidarity with those whom we consider family, relatives, our brothers and sisters, and standing for the Black Lives Matter movement. While New Zealanders and Australians have been vocal and staunch in their support in this respect, there, however, seems to be something of a disconnect, because there is and has been a deafening silence and denial about the reality of ongoing racism and injustice against the indigenous peoples native to these lands. In Australia, for instance, Aboriginal people have been and continue to be killed at the hands of the police in tragic numbers. But the response to this by the majority in Australia has and continues to be negligible. Earlier this year in New Zealand, a report was released after a study into racism in our justice system in New Zealand. The study found that Māori first-time offenders are 7 times more likely to end up in court than Pākehā or white New Zealanders in exactly the same situation. Research showed that police are 8 times more likely to use a taser on Māori and Pākehā in the exact same conditions. Another particularly heartbreaking finding was that Māori women would rather stay with an abusive partner than deal with the racism in the justice system. Māori women are more scared of the state, of the police, than they are of their partner's fists. But the justice system does not stand alone. Conversations in New Zealand have therefore been around the interconnectedness of racism and violence in the justice system with other areas such as education, economics, as been mentioned, and health, in which Māori are also more adversely affected. Racism is systemic and systematic. To treat racism, therefore, there needs to be a complete revision, a dismantling and a decolonization of these systems globally and in our own context. And I'll speak more to that when we come to our next issue of where we go from here.
Thank you so much. I want to bring in Angela, Dr. Angela Herbert here. And could you tell us about one, as what you've heard, if you can respond to anything there that sort of resonates with you. Also tell us about your work as it intersects with racial justice, equality, and violence. Because I like the way you are we're not just talking, you are a solution-oriented person. And that's so important for these conversations, and certainly for how can we construct a global movement and galvanize that. In addition, could you provide us with some, I don't know if your mind is rolling and moving, any specific ways in which we could improve, make improvement towards an effective global collaboration and action? What are some of the things that are rolling in your mind in terms of this leading somewhere, as you've seen the George Floyd and ongoing, and even today, I've seen there are protests in England, and you know, it's powerful when I see it all over the world.
So thank you very much for inviting me onto this forum, and it's been very interesting listening to people even from different parts of the world and their reflection on what happened to George Floyd. He was not the first, and as was said earlier, he probably would not be the last. Racism, as we've heard, is systemic. It's historic, and our faith, I think, gives us some hope, and indeed it does give me some. So we're talking about the system, and we're talking about the higher levels of the system, and we're talking about transformation and change. And I tend to work with people on the ground, and have done since I became a born-again Christian some 36 years ago. And when I became a Christian, I wanted to work. I wanted to do stuff, because Jesus did stuff. You know, he didn't sit in the church. He went out and he engaged with the people. So that's kind of some of the things that I do. I'm very fortunate to have worked voluntary in prisons through prison ministry, and then went on to work within the criminal justice system in a non-operational role within the prisons as senior leader, and then in policy and in education. So in relation to the work that I'm doing right now that would address this issue, I would say at a community level, because I believe that you have to address the small areas in order to reach a macro, because we know what we're dealing with. And I think that trying to eat the elephant whole is kind of difficult. You have to eat little bits at a time. And while we're trying to eat the whole elephant, while there are people suffering at the ground, that's kind of where I believe that it needs to happen at both ends, from the top, from the bottom, and somehow we may meet in the middle. But I'm about dealing with stuff now, and hopefully joining those fires up globally. So I'll tell you very quickly, because I've got a couple of minutes, and I could speak for England, but I won't. So I chair the Violent Crime Prevention Board, and its membership is made up of a range of high-profile influencers who volunteer their expertise in specific areas of focus addressed around identified themes. So we have, within our group, we have researchers, and we work with University College London and through the Centre for Global City Police. We commission research, and so we've been looking at what some of the factors are to prevent violent crime. We recognize, as the previous speaker spoke about, the disproportionality, and that's what we're dealing with here in the UK, and it's historic. This is not new. 36 years ago, when I started volunteering in prisons, there was disproportionality. Now there still is. Young people, 56% of young people in custody are Black, and I was saying prior to this forum that many of the young people that I meet as an official in custody are children of Christian parents or reverends, etc. And so there's something to think about there. So some of the themes that we have identified and work with, they include youth. That's not just talking at, but listening and trying to understand their experiences, their hopes and their aspirations. And as seniors, therefore, it's our duty to enable them to achieve. So we have champions, professionals that enable young people. They will take them into their space to see what it is to be there. The narrative on our young people is often very negative, and what we're doing is trying to shine a light on what is seemingly dark and hopeless for those young people. We also have a families theme where we identify and signpost parents to opportunities where they can share, they can get mentorship, they can have peer discussions about some of the challenges faced in 21st century parenting, and also mentorship for young people. We think about the parents, obviously, because you can't just work with young people and then return them to whatever lives they're facing. And of course, racism and discrimination has an impact on all of their lives. Socioeconomic issues affect us all, predominantly from the BME community, which seems to be at the bottom rung of the ladder always. Education is another theme of ours, where we're addressing the needs of our young people, trying to prevent them from being excluded from education, but also trying to back a campaign for inclusive curriculum that presents the civilization of African people rather than their enslavement. This is really imperative to give them hope. And we get behind lobbyists on this issue. And we also work very closely with the police. So on our board, we have very active police staff, and we look at the importance of enhancing those relationships, including having a view about improving their powers to stop and search, or in America I know it's called stop and frisk, because that is a real huge issue here. But But what we're trying to do is to deal with a solution as opposed to the problem. There is a problem, but if we're out and we're active, we're hoping that training and actually engaging would actually break down some of those barriers. Another area, of course, is health and mental health. People from our community are more likely to be diagnosed with mental health issues. But I heard the other day that I think it was in 2018 they discovered that the psychology route is quite racist in itself. So that's why you have so many people that are diagnosed with mental health issues when they may not even have them. And then there's also trauma that people face from their lived experience. It can be that they were involved in some criminal justice system, which can affect one in a traumatic way. So we're actually working with health and mental health. We've got some very eminent people working with us there, and also faith, of course. And what can faith do? What can the faith community do in a practical level? And this is not just local. This, of course, is global, because where local government, local authorities are struggling with finance, or community organizations are trying to get finance to support things, the church is right there. I'm not talking about other faiths, right? I'm talking about the church. And so they have buildings that they can open, they can engage young people, they can actually have adults in there, they can run different schemes from those buildings that are there. And at the end of it, it's not even about just providing that service, but our role as faith is to provide for the community, and inadvertently they can then turn to faith, because that's what we want. So we believe from the Violent Crime Prevention Board that the ethos of actually elevating communities, from a local level, can help to bring a change. So supporting one another. So we talk about the village. It takes a village to raise a child, but it takes a community, those of us that have specialisms, those of us that have expertise and finances. We can do that locally. And if we light those small fires around the world, that's a global change. And that's doing it from a practical sense, very locally, which I believe that having influences at a higher level can reach the top, but we have to address the needs of people on the ground. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. People on the ground, Reverend Mark Sturge, talking about people on the ground and talking about the local importance of local action. How well are the Black majority churches in the UK? And also tell us about your work goes beyond that with Christian Aid in terms of trying to bring about transformation at a local level in the UK.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for both inviting me to the conversation and also the conversation that is going on so far. I find it very stimulating in terms of trying to just wrap around our minds around some of the real challenges or opportunities that exist. I think I come to the conversation almost with a critical mind, as well as an appreciation of where we are, in the sense that this is the first time I have seen so many Black majority church leaders at least say something about what is happening in the current situation. I've seen denominations sent around letters, they've put things on their websites, there's a lot of conversations on Facebook and so forth from church leaders, which is unheard of. The second part of it is, which is good to see, is that passion is also available to the church. Sometimes that is not always seen or recognized, but there's something different in their conversation. But I think if I look at some of the challenges and then look at some opportunities for Black majority churches, I come back to the international context. So maybe I might want to start there. In terms of the international context, one of the things that has been evident, whichever continent we work in, it is the Black people or darker skinned people, whether you work in South America, whether you work in Africa, whether you work in sort of in East Asia or wherever you work, Bangladesh, India, wherever we work, it is the darker skinned people for some reason who are on the bottom of the pile, even amongst the poor. And part of the challenge, I have been very deliberate in leading my team to say, I don't want you to go and talk to churches over 2 years to see if they will support people who are living in poverty, those who are at the other end of justice. Let's put a challenge directly to them that says, how are you going to answer the question of Matthew 25:25 when Jesus takes it personal and says, when I come, I am going to separate the sheep from the goat, and I'm going to ask you, what have you done when I was hungry, when I was thirsty, and all the rest of it? And I suppose when we ask those questions of leaders, they have to respond. There's not an opt-out clause. But I can still tell you that I find Black majority churches the least responsive to that challenge. Not because they don't want to. Some is about capacity. Some is that overcommitment in other areas. But by and large, I still think there's a lot of work for Black majority churches to do on that. The other thing that was of interest to me, and over the last 2 years, we spent our time asking London, what does justice look like? We held the 50th anniversary for the assassination of Martin Luther King at Westminster Abbey a couple of years ago. And more than 2,000 people turned up to that service. And part of it was that we wanted to ask the question afresh. And at that point, I think it was the second day of our new chief executive coming, the level of passion, the level of anger, almost synonymous to what you're seeing in the street, whereby Black people challenging the response of the church, the response of agencies like Christian Aid, was something that actually, I think, changed the course of how we went about doing what we did. But coming back locally in terms of the challenge for Black majority churches in the UK, I think we have a challenge of both perception and strategy. Perception in the sense that we haven't come to a common mind about what the role and the task of the church is in the United Kingdom. In other words, if you ask most churches, they would want to say, to win the loss at any cost. Neither do we have a very clear strategy of how we exercise the responsibility we have as a collective group. And that poses a number of problems. I say that because I define British society in general as a part society. When I use the word part, I mean it is predatorial in the way it does business, in the way it does, the way it organizes itself, very predatory practices is part of the nature of things. It's adversarial in terms of how we do our law, how we converse in the media, in education, the way we teach education. It's in an adversarial way. So you're always bringing two sides against each other in order to come to whatever resolutions you want to do. But it's also racist. And that is, at least for the majority of Black people, they understand that to be the case. There are a number of reports after reports after reports, including the McPherson reports, which said the police is institutional racist. But in a sense, Britain does not like to look at the issue of race. And so we prefer to look at issues around diversity and inclusion. which in a sense is a dilution of the realities for Black people. And what it does, it opens the net so that every other issue can be brought into the same conversation. So, and in those cases, race gets put to the sideline. And the final thing I will think is about the territorial nature. There's a saying in Britain about NIMBYism, not in my backyard. I'm happy to come to visit you in your islands and in your countries for holidays, but don't come and live next to me. And this idea of how we organize communities and societies, and that is undergirded by a political point of view. Whether you use Margaret Thatcher, who says there is nothing like society. First, it's an individual, and then that individual's family. And once they've dealt with those, they can deal with their neighbors. But forget society and the state. We don't have a responsibility for you. Although people don't have the courage to say that as boldly as that, the way we operate and the way we put systems and processes in place says that that is alive and well. But also the idea of, even someone like Tony Blair used to have this idea of tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, which I interpreted to mean tough on Blacks and tough on the causes of Black, which comes down to immigration and so forth. And then we had a hostile environment, which led to some of the issues around the Windrush that took place. And so that's the context in which we live. And so when the church is working out its role and its responsibility, it has to be within a context and not only within the context of Scripture. And there's something that Dr. Angela said earlier about the church using its resources and other things like that. If we were to hold up a mirror to the church so that they can see exactly what they say to themselves or what we say to ourselves around the church being salt, the church being light. From my theological point of view, when we talk about salt, the church tells us things that we need to preserve. Whereas my understanding of what Jesus is saying is that this is a user-led initiative. It is the users who will determine whether you are good or whether you add any value to them. And if you don't add any value to them, then they will trample you under their feet because you've lost whatever you have to offer. But then the positive side of that is the light, in the sense of, if you allow your good works to be seen, then God will be glorified. And those are two opportunities that the church has that it could use for its own benefit. If we were to think, though, that the Black majority church is not a homogeneous group, we have Black majority churches in historic denominations, Methodist, Anglican, Baptist, and so forth. And then you have Black majority churches from the African and Caribbean diaspora. At least in the Methodist context and the historic denominations, they deal with race on the basis that each one of them has got an officer that deals with race. They've got committees that deal with race throughout the year, and at least once a year in September, they mark Racial Justice Sunday. On the other hand, Black majority church from the diaspora communities have nothing. Yes, some of them would do Black History Month, but by and large, they tend to prefer the idea of unity rather than talking about race. And there's a lot of conversation we could have about what's the difference between unity and race. And I think there's a big difference between those two.
Okay, let me pull it in there, Doctor. Thank you so much, Pastor Sturge. Dr. Japi Laporta, and the idea of unity and justice. Just share with us about your work as it intersects with race and justice, and how you think it could speak into a broader global context, especially as you see what's taking place today across the world. How do you reflect upon it, and what sort of insights could you share into a global conversation?
I think in a global conversation, it is important to remember the dictum Martin Luther King said. He said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. First, we need to identify that we are not alone in our struggles against oppression. It's a global thing. It happens throughout the world. And we need to stand together. We need to find each other and try to understand each other's context before we presumptuously come up with solutions to what would happen elsewhere. In our own context, where we had to struggle for the unification of the Apostolic Faith Mission of South Africa, we started from our base, which was the segregation of Black churches on the basis of ethnicity. We had to find each other first. And when we have found each other, we were able to together in unity speak to the whites about the issue of being excluded on the basis of race. This does not mean that we do not have or encountered serious problems, because we then discovered the important issue of what Ellen Busak many years ago said, the greatest ally of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. We were struggling with people simply to comprehend the fact that the oppression we were suffering under was not divine. It was human created, and it had to change through human efforts. Because as Pentecostals, people are eager to rush to a spiritual solution and want us just to pray and wait. Whereas we need to pray and work. We need to pray and do something. And that is what is happening in the global scene today with the issue of George Floyd. People are praying together, but some people went out in the streets and are doing something. And the impact that we feel at the present moment globally is not so much the prayer, but what people are doing. The fact that they are out there declaring that this racism, systemic racism, is unjust. It is not acceptable. And that is the importance. We need to unite, and we need to learn from each other, and we need to be open to share together in order to go forward on a global stage. Thank you.
Let me pull in Dr. Antipas Harris here, who has just written a book on Is Christianity a White Man's Religion? And could you just share with us, from your perspective, from what you've heard, in terms of trying to speak into a global conversation? One of the things that I've heard you talking about is how whiteness and white supremacy, as it morphed into colonialism, as it impacts Christianity. And Dr. LaPunta has talked about the fact that we often want to lead to prayers and spiritual things, and maybe So tell us about what you think the global whiteness and global sort of white supremacy, as it morphs into institutions, into mindsets, and so on and so forth. What can be done on a local and international level to begin to deconstruct that?
Good. Thank you, Dr. Clark, for the question and the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. It's such a tremendous blessing to meet all the panelists from so many different places and so many different perspectives. I think that the shared community we have is that blackness has been not only disrespected, but undermined and dehumanized around the world. And I think that point has not been emphasized as much as we talk about the outcomes of that point, which is, I think, to begin to get into, to begin to dismantle whiteness, a few things need to happen. One, there is not a collective or a global acknowledgement that blackness has not only been dehumanized, but blackness has been considered less human than whiteness. And it was exemplified by several of the panelists, but one of the panelists mentioned how there was a person who said, "Oh, I didn't know our people were capable of doing this." For a person who's been told that something happens, does nothing about it, later says, "I didn't know my people were capable of doing this," is because in the subconscious of whiteness around the world is that black voice does not matter. And what we say has to be legitimized by an assumption of the superiority of whiteness. Does that make sense? The point is that whiteness has to legitimize even the statements that black people make. And so until we acknowledge the fact that there is a global assumption that whiteness is superior to blackness, we can never even move toward strategic proposals to dismantle it. There has to be a collective understanding that the modern history of our world, dating at least back to the 15th century or the 16th century, has been this assumption that black and brownness does not count. All right, so this is why it's so profound that the movement of Black Lives Matter, the language there, Black Lives Matter, that's the fundamental, simple point that needs to be driven into the consciousness of the world. Secondly, I think that when we agree that Black lives do matter, and I don't mean black people agree that Black lives matter, I mean that is being seared into the minds of a global reaction to George Floyd, which I think is quite profound. We know that black people have been killed in unprecedented rates and demeaning manners. But George Floyd's situation has shocked the consciousness of the world, maybe because it was at the same time that COVID-19 had already slowed the world down long enough to even care. So now people are like, "Oh wow, Black Lives Matter." Okay, now we got people knowing that Black Lives Matter, but the next step is that how do you realize that? Because I've seen people, these sacramental activities of washing feet and cleaning shoes and apologizing and all that. All that's great, but we're not looking for white friends. That's not what we're marching about, right? We want friends. We don't want to be shot, but that's not the movement. At the root of this is an economic reality and a reality of power. And that power plays out largely in political power. But economic power is so important because for more than 400 years, if you can convince a world that these people don't matter, and you can dismantle their power and access to excess, then you can affect generations after them. So we are beneficiaries of a global crisis that was created long before we came along. But not only are we victims or beneficiaries of that, also the white people of the world, of the Western world in particular, and also in Africa, are beneficiaries of a system that they personally didn't create. And therefore they're often blindsided by it, right? If I'm a privileged victim, then I can just search my heart and determine whether I like these people and then benefit from the system that is oppressing them and don't even know it. So that's why I think that the religious world has played into this problem, because we have done this privatized, the Lord saves your heart kind of a thing. And people get saved in their heart and play into a system that is diabolical, and they don't even see the spiritual wickedness in high places because they're focused on their own devotional time. So this is why we need not only a church that focuses on the privatize of the sin within, but the sin without. We have a corrupt world. We have a complete disrespect and disregard for Black life, period, much less than Black economics or Black education. You know, we've raised enough hell to change a few laws, but changing laws don't change the systemic and the social realities that have perpetuated the problem all along. So we need to thirdly, we need to partner with whites who agree with us. And many times Blacks change our language and reframe how we're going to say it so we don't offend whiteness. Well, that's part of the problem. Because if white people are really interested in helping to change the world, they want to hear the truth. Because what we're talking about right here is not a Black people problem only. This is a world problem. And when we change this, the whole world benefits from it, not just Black people. So my point is that the way the education systems, at least in the United States, have been structured, have isolated and excluded much of Black history. And so then in the subconsciousness of the American mind, what we're talking about is for us, by us. When reality is that what we're talking about is American history. It is Western history. It is everybody's problem. So as the more we can get more people to join together to understand that this long-term trauma that the Blackness of the world has endured for several hundred years, we will never be able to transform it or to move against it. And I think, lastly, I think this is not only an economic problem, not only an educational problem, but this is a religious problem. Evangelicalism has not taken seriously the role that the church has played. Catholicism started it, but they have along the way in many places and many times have at least referenced the reality that they of the problem. Okay. Evangelicalism, they need to do some stuff too, but evangelicalism has only doubled down on it and has only perpetuated the problem, so much so that Black people of the world and brown people of the world are kicking against Christianity and declaring it the white man's religion and going to like Black Hebrew Israelites, science of consciousness, expanded consciousness, indigenous, searching for indigenous African expressions of religion, all to trying to get away from this thing that has been a moral problem. And we've been blindsided by what we see in Kumbaya. So hopefully those points are beneficial and add something to the conversation.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you, Dr. Harris. I want to join Dr. Nathan, Ronald Nathan at this point. Can you come in and respond? I know that you've put some messages up here, particularly about the church's response to race and theologically and what have you, and somehow tie that into a global conversation. How does that sort of resonate globally?
Wow. There's so much that I've heard. I want to say thank you first for the invitation to be a part of this conversation and to be a part of this conversation with so many of our eminent panelists and attendees. I feel like I've been there before. I've heard similar discussions and receive apologies and shared platforms with my white colleagues in the United Kingdom in particular. But the situation still remains the same. And so, as it has been said before, there will be more exploitation of police power at our expense. Whether that be, and I'm saying our because I've only just transitioned from the UK back to the Caribbean. And so I'm speaking about the UK context, and then I'd link it to the Caribbean. For the Black Christian in the United Kingdom, there has not been a critique of the theology that we have received, predominantly within the Pentecostal tradition. We have not critiqued the fact that, and I think our last speaker was pointing in that direction, in regards to the missiology that created the churches that we are a part of. And the whole idea of the white man's burden, the idea of the marriage between colonialism and the missionary effort. I'm a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and the colonialists frowned upon the AME and the AME Zion sending missionaries to Africa. And I wondered why for a long time, until I realized that our very existence and presence on the African continent as missionaries challenged colonialism and white superiority. The fact that we could even send missionaries, one, and then secondly, that as we arrived, we were saying Black people can lead themselves and they can interpret the text without reference to Europe or the European in a Western context. And so I'm coming back now to the UK to say that the average Christian and the average pastor within the Black church refuses to critique that issue, and therefore will not speak out on racism so that the white person next to them in the Kumbaya line would hear clearly that what you've been doing to us is devilish. What you have justified within your civilization is devilish. It does not conform to the teachings of Scripture. And our hesitation to do that. Okay, let me just back up and say that last week I was on a prayer call, and I have a white minister who we've grown pretty close because the last church I was pastoring was the nearest church to hers, and I refused to allow her and the other white ministers not to know who I am, and that I must be in every circle that they are in. And one of the things I had to say to her as we were about to pray is, I want to apologize for not always telling you the truth, because I wanted to secure our fellowship. But how can we fellowship unless we agree? And so those are some of the things that challenges me as a local minister. And I'm not one of the quietest persons that you will find. But certainly, I think that we have to get to the root of why do we do what we do in the UK context, And that therefore requires an interrogation of the theology and the tools of theology that we use, why it is that we spiritualize everything and not ask what was the agenda when this text was given and what is the social agenda. And I think to respond to Mark's question about why we don't have racial justice officers, it may just be that we need to have justice ministries. And we may need to also unravel the issue about social service rather than calling for social justice, because we do social service.
But could the problem be, like Carver Anderson, who's one of the attendees to the conference, is saying that that we don't have, before we can have officers, we can have all of this, we don't have. His question is, how can black churches develop a theology of hope and liberation that engages with social political issues and concerns? So the problem is not just a lack of initiative, but it's a theological problem.
Well, yes, it is a theological problem, and therefore we either have to do Bible study differently, so that we start the Bible study from the issues that exist within our society and begin to address that, as opposed to starting, and I'm sure that I'll come back on this, because we tend to start from the text. And the text always seem to exclude our context. So I'm saying, let's start from our context and say, folks, here we are. About 3 days ago, I found out that one of our colleagues has had a mental breakdown and he's going back into the system. So Bible study for me, if I was in the UK, this week would start with that issue. And from there, begin to interrogate the text as it speaks to the issues that we are facing. Until we do that and our people understand it is Christian to do that.
So
At present, they believe it is not a Christian thing to do.
It's a hermeneutical issue.
Yeah.
Hermeneutical shift. Let me pull in here, Doctor, talking about hermeneutical shift, Dr. Van Gaten, and I gave you a question that I had for you here, but I'll be interested just to hear your response, just to stay within the thought process of from what you've heard, and how that reflects upon your work and your own contribution.
We're not hearing you, sir.
Sorry, Dr. Clark. I'm so glad to be a part of this conversation. I just have a few tidbits that I want to offer, because I want to piggyback off of several things that have been said. And the last brother there, I think we have to face that there is a hermeneutical imperialism in the earth today. And from the inception of church history, whites have always decided what truth is. But now we're living in a period of time where blacks are scholars as well. And I think there has to be a challenge. So as Dr. Antipas was sharing, whom I love very much, I think it's time we spoke the truth to whites. Exactly. And let me go one step further, not only on the theology that has oppressed us, the use of God's word. I think it was the German philosopher George Hegel, who wrote a book called the Philosophy of History. And in that book, he cited how the continent of Africa offers nothing of any value to the rest of civilization. So that was written off. That was his attitude. Immanuel Kant gave us that higher being kind of idea that whites were superior and we were lower than everyone else. So we can run down through Jonathan Edwards, the great Puritan, saying that, yes, we're all going to go to, we all need Jesus together. Blacks and whites need Jesus, but we're not going to be in heaven together. So one of my studies has been I've looked at the main protagonists who have taught such a racist theology against us that the Word of God does not justify. And I think we have to not only challenge whites with the truth about Scripture and history, but I think it's time for us to call out by name those who are speaking against us and have beaten us down and have twisted the Scripture demonically to suppress us and oppress us. I think it's time. Now, Dr. Clifton, just yesterday, I've been praying about this a while. And by the way, I believe in piety and protests. So in Jacksonville, I've been to 3 marches, peaceful marches, but I spoke at City Hall on steps and made a pronouncement and shared with them all these kinds of things that are from the Word of God and what we need to say. But I think it's also time for us to recognize that so yesterday I was on a conference call that I didn't know was going to happen. So just give you a quick little testimony that leads to this point. For several years, I was also a high school principal in a white community of a gated community school. So these are rich people, all right? Well, yesterday, one of the parents of the students contacted somebody else that I didn't know about and said, you need to get a hold of Dr. Gayton. Now, I was on a call yesterday with 60 white preachers, theologians, scholars, millionaires, and their question to me was, first of all, we're reading your book right now, they said, and they said, tell us what we need to do, because there's a movement in the earth right now amongst whites called Celebration of Jesus 2033. So they've got leaders all over the world leading towards 2033 to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. And yet they realize that they're not able to get everybody together in America or in Australia or in New Zealand because of the prejudice. And so they very honestly, and I think this is what I really want to say, where we've been reluctant to say it like it is for fear of offending whites, although they've never feared offending us. And I think that's where we have to be. We have to have that kind of side of Martin Luther King Jr. where it's peaceful. But, I think it's important that we have a little bit of Malcolm X in us too. And I think that, so to all this group, to 60 people, I shared with them how when the African enslaved arrived on the shores of America, I said, you had the Africans coming over against their will when the Europeans came over here willingly. So that creates 2 stories, and America has majored on the European story, Western civilization, and never listened to our story, and it's time you did. Now, in America, I believe the climate is right. We can carpe diem, we can seize the day, because if ever we needed to stand up and speak our message, it's right now. I think they're more susceptible and open, that there's a bigger group open through Black Lives Matter and others. We see all these people asking, what do we do? Okay, we'll stop selling this. We'll stop making Aunt Jemima pancake covers. All of a sudden they're making all this, but the church has got to be right there, the salt and the light in the earth. And I think that's really important us to strike while the iron's hot. And as Pentecostals, again, we've been given to piety, and so we're behind the times when we should be on the avant-garde of leading. And so I think that that's critical to us. So guess what? Tomorrow I'm going to be preaching a Sunday morning message called on Father's Day. My message is going to be the Father's Heart, Justice for All. And don't you know that 60-something members from that white group yesterday, 2 multimillionaires, several scholars and theologians and lay people, lay guys who love the Lord are going to tune in. They want to hear my message as whites. They want to hear, what does the Bible have to say? What is God's view of justice? Where does justice fit into this? And again, we all know that we'll never have the unity between the black and white church until they acknowledge the issue of justice, that the injustice that has taken place. But also, Dr. Clark, I think what's important, a couple other issues, is...
That's one of those.
One of them?
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to give you the main one. I'll give you the main one. There are over 1,200 think tanks in Washington, D.C. I used to be a part of the Institute of Religion of Public Policy in D.C. And as a result of being a part of this public policy, an NGO, a non-governmental agency, I traveled all over the world, invited by the King of Morocco and other places, and gave lectures on this. But I learned from that NGO that we need an international group that are qualified to be a part of, make up national public policy, that we can speak to the highest ranks and influence, as well as boots on the ground, that we've got that. So we need several branches moving, as well as rewriting history and getting out textbooks that tell our story along with America. We've got to do these things, but as Antipas shared, we've got to boldly yet lovingly tell white America and Europe and Australia from a black perspective, this is the truth, and you got to come to grips with it.
Right, thank you so much. Dawn Lewingson, thank you very much, Dr. Gayton. And Dawn, you've been telling what white people and Caucasians, how it is, right, in your training. And I wonder if you could share with us, how have you contributed towards alleviating racial injustice, inequality, and violence in your work as a diversity and inclusion consultant in the UK? And what are some of the main lessons you could share with us here today?
Well, thank you, everybody, for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. I'm coming from a very particular local perspective, in that I work in the UK, although I've worked in Europe and as far afield as in Australia. However, my work entails not looking at the black experience or the racial injustice linked to violence. The nearest I come across in terms of racial injustice and inequality is really more linked to the microaggressions that our people face in the corporate world. So a number of things that I notice, that I go in and I deliver training and consultancy work in the corporate space, and I hardly see people like me. It's very rare that I go into the C-suite of an organisation and there are people that look like me in those senior positions. They're elsewhere within the organisations, but they're not at the top. So one of the things that I have to do in delivering what I deliver, and Mark Sturgey mentioned the D&I, the diversity and inclusion work, that sometimes race gets left off, but you know what? When a black person comes in the room, they have to talk about race. That you cannot not talk about it when a black person's there. So my duty, in some respects, is to hold up a mirror to these people in these senior positions within organisations, and let them know, based on the fact that they brought me in and they want to have this conversation, that I am then mirroring up to them what their organisations look like. So I'm exposing the inequalities around promotion, around who gets disciplined more often than not, and who gets reported, and who's at the bottom and who's at the top. What's your ethnic breakdown within your organisation? So that's the sort of thing that I do. So if we just take, say, the NHS, the National Health Service, and I haven't even talked about the church. I don't do this work, funnily enough, linked to what Mark said, in the black churches. I do this work in the established churches, the Church of England. So it's interesting that we can have this conversation now, and we are having this conversation now as a result of what has happened, the George Floyd issue. But I think that we should take this conversation into our own black churches. Some of the challenges that I face and I have to help alleviate are all those ways in which organisations devalue black people in what they do and how they do things, their systems and their processes. And it's not a silver bullet that can make a difference, but there are ways in which we can get accountability at the senior levels. One of the things that's been happening, my phone, my emails have been bombarded these last 2-3 weeks since the death of George Floyd, with organisations and clients saying, we need to have a conversation, we need to do it now. And they were willing to put it on hold because of COVID. They didn't want to, let's postpone it, let's not do anything. But suddenly now there is this momentum for making a difference and making a change. Yeah. And I'm just grabbing it with both hands, because I want to get the messages out there about the 400 years of systemic racism that has occurred, that has put people in a situation where there's this white supremacy, there's white hierarchy, and that's holding our people down. So the church has been complicit in this. And I'm glad that the Church of England are calling me and saying, what can we do? What do we need to hear? What do we need to understand? There are some organisations that are, they're jumping on the bandwagon, so to speak. And there's this, what I call performative allyship. And I think if they even do make a statement, but then I'm there to make them accountable around the statements that they're making. Whatever they're publishing, they've got black staff within their organisations that need to see the difference that they're making, and not just ticking a box and not just paying lip service to what's going on currently. So I think that just the local and very kind of unique place in which I am in, it's really about accountability. It's about in terms of corporate speak, it's KPIs, it's setting objectives, and it's really getting actions from these senior leaders about what they're going to do, and then coming after them when they don't do what they say that they will do. The other part of that is empowering the black people within those organisations, so that enabling the organisations to create those that culture whereby people can speak up without being jeopardised in some way, without feeling that it's a career-limiting moment because they are saying that this isn't right and this isn't fair. So I think there's a great opportunity now that they're wanting to do something, they're wanting to make changes, and if they see that their competitors are doing something because it's making a difference, then they want to do something also. So it's interesting in that there are different levers that you can use within organisations to really get the buy-in that we need to start making the differences to our people in these organisations. In the NHS, there was a report written by Roger Klein, and he called out the issues because the title of his report was "The Snowy White Peaks of the NHS." So people have been calling it out, but now we need the accountability, we need the objective setting, we need the Black voices to be heard. And that's another thing. This is the first time for a long time that organisations have said to me, we have all these Black staff and we're concerned. We know that they're experiencing trauma, they're experiencing the outcomes of COVID, and we want, what can we do to hear their voices, to hear their lived experience within our organisations, and what we can start doing about it. Now, some people say that we shouldn't have to tell them what to do, but if they don't know, let's tell them. We don't want to keep them waiting. We do want them to find out. We do want to tell them where to go and find the information, but we're not going to pamper to the white fragility. We're not going to pamper to their tactics. We're wanting the momentum to make the difference within organisations for the everyday person working in the corporate spaces that they have to go in.
Okay.
And it needs to be different.
I want to thank you so much, Dawn. Thank you so much. I want to draw in, before we transition, and then I'm going to come back to Joel to give us some analysis of all of this. And and I'm going to move to in the second part. You're going to be a lot quicker, but I'm going to ask you to come up with some specific strategy, action. What can we do? What would you want to happen? Is there anything that we can start together that can be concrete? But let me ask, last year I was in Ghana, and I was like many other people, 16, 19, I went back, and I'm sure many of you also. And I was blessed to see the Minister of Finance, Minister of Education, and a lot of it was talking about how can we galvanize the diasporan economies and finances of Blacks. And the president said that African Americans, I'm not sure if he included Africans in the diaspora, but certainly African Americans can get a free path to citizenship very quickly. And something that Frank Chikane mentioned earlier, the biggest challenge is to do with economics, because no matter how much we talk, if we are economically weak, if we cannot hurt the economy by withdrawing our substance, we need to fix that. And so part of that, again, is the economy of Africa. So my question for Dr. Albert Isando is, before we transition, is in what ways could Africans in the diaspora, strengthen and galvanize our economic ties for African uplifts? How can we begin, if we're going to begin to talk about the strength of African peoples, we really need it to also be seen in the African continent. So how can we begin to bring about that sort of unity, if that's possible? And tell us a little bit about your work. I know you're a businessman as well, and so you might have some other thoughts about that. That's Dr. Isando. Is he still there? Oh, okay. I thought you bailed on me. Oh, we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah,
okay,
yeah.
I apologize. Thanks for the opportunity to answer this question. It's a great question. And just want to say quickly about myself. I'm an ordained minister, and my wife and I, we work in communities, low-income communities or economically disadvantaged communities. My wife is a mental health therapist, so we work a lot in these communities where we see everyday grandma helping kids to do homework, no father at home, lack of mentors, poverty. So I want to say I connect with everything that is being said. Now, having said that, I wanted to answer your question in different ways. I was very surprised when I started my small business here in the United States, because I found out that there is a lot of incentives in the United States for small businesses to succeed. It will blow your mind that there are more incentives for minority-owned and women-owned businesses than even white-owned businesses. I was very surprised to find out, and I have been a volunteer for the Small Business Administration and SCORE, where we mentor small businesses. I've done a lot of consulting work along those areas, helping mentor small businesses to grow. And what I found out, which I would connect with your African question, is that there is Martin Luther King Jr. made a statement saying, how can you tell somebody to strap their boots when they do not really have boots to wear? And so there is a big problem to start off with, in that in the African American community, we do not find enough qualified people to put on those boots, let alone to ask them to strap their boots. And so, and of course, this has to do with the racial injustice. I was shocked when I studied education and did a lot of research to find out the graduation rates in the African American community. And then you look at, after the graduation rate from high school, college graduation rates, and then you look at how many people make it into middle level management in corporate America. There are less than 1% CEOs right now in Fortune 500 companies. So and then of course, these racial disparities and discrimination is coming from the system, the way by which America has been designed and built. Let me give you an example, and I'll jump to that question. You would find out that schools are organized by zip codes in America. So when you live in a community where the income level is very low, your child would definitely end up in a school that has less resources. So any middle-level American who wants their children to be more successful would have to buy a house in a community that has better schools, meaning you're going to spend more money on buying a house. Now, in the United States or worldwide, the concept of wealth is tied to home ownership. So for instance, if you want to start a small business in America, you can take a line of credit against your house, and you can get your small business up and running in a very easy way. Now, the problem I'm trying to come up with is the fact that there are very few African Americans who have the kind of wealth that enables them to invest abroad. This question is a complex one because we have a lot of African Americans. I mean, if you look at the income gap, the gap between white and Black Americans, it's more than 5 times. So to talk about investing in Africa, becoming a part of the prosperity of Africa is a very big subject, or a very heavy load we put on the African American communities who are still trying to even resolve their own local sustenance or challenges. However, having said that, in order to reach out internationally, the first thing I would suggest, and it's a good thing people are beginning to travel, is for people to travel and see and understand the culture. Let me give you a quick story here. When I was in college in Ghana, we had some African Americans come over, and we were taking them around to visit Ghana and other parts of West Africa. We took them to a village in Ghana, and the Ghanaian villagers who had, not been very much exposed to, the Western culture, were using a Ghanaian Akan word to refer to these African Americans, and the word was Obroni. Now, the word Obroni is actually the silk color of the corn. The corn, if you look at the corn ears, it has a silk hair on top of it. Now, that word was used to describe the white man when they first came into Ghana by the Akans. Now, what baffled these African Americans, and some of them were very upset, was because their fellow black was referencing them by calling them a white. You see, and this is very interesting. I was very surprised that the African American friends who were taken around were taken aback. But you see, the point here is these Africans, out of their innocence, were describing African Americans as whites, not because of their color, but because of their culture. And a lot of times, African Americans miss this point, that even though you are black, to the African mind, we don't look at things from a race perspective. We see you by culture. So when you come into Africa to invest, the African American has to learn the difference between their blackness and the African blackness, because there is a big difference. And when we come to understand that, then we can be able to plug ourselves in correctly in the different cultures. Now, in terms of ways by which we can participate, of course, we can visit. That is one important thing. Another important thing is to take advantage of the programs that we have here in the United States. The United States government has a lot of financing to support small businesses that invest abroad. There are a lot of incentives here in the United States. So I would say, in short, that we need to research and find out the resources here. There are a lot of them. Unfortunately, we don't have people making that information available to the African American community, but we can leverage those resources and find ways by which we can invest in Africa. And for instance, you can go invest into real estate, because those are the kinds of things that we find people doing here in the United States. So in a nutshell, I would say that Africa does need the African American community. We need them also to advocate. It is very important because the economic relationships between African countries and the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank still propagate white supremacy. Think about it this way. Africans are still being given loans, and the terms and conditions of the loans are very unfair. The French, and I'm speaking specifically about France, France is still colonizing African countries. The Francophone countries, they pay over 40% of their income generated to France. The income that the French colonized countries in Africa earn goes through the French banks. And then the French banks, the French central government, loans 30% of the income that they have made back to the French countries. That is slavery. So we would need, more than just investing. We would need lobbying these institutions that do business with the African countries, so that, whereas we are trying to get, individuals investing into Africa, we are also looking at the political and the international implications, the global institutions that have been giving Africans money and is keeping them in poverty. It is about time we dissolve those institutions. It is about time those structures be reconstituted. We cannot belong to a United Nations where a small group of countries determines the future of Africa. We don't have a say in the United Nations. So all these things are centered around the themes of white supremacy and racism, because if we are all equal, then let's get back to the United Nations and let's sit on that seat with equal power and authority and make decisions for the success of Africa. Thank you.
Sir. Thank you very much. Very powerful words there. So we've said a lot in the past couple of hours, and we want to kind of get this ship to dock somewhere. And so as we transition, I'm going to ask Joel to, Dr. Edwards, to help us process what you've been picking up. And then I'm going to ask you, and just very short, quickly, because we've got 30 minutes left, the rest of you to kind of give some specific things that, ways that we could contribute towards a global fight against racism and racial violence? What are some of the specific things we can do? So now we're going to put on our sort of solutions hat, operational hats. Dr. Edwards.
Yeah. Joel is good too. I answer to that.
Okay.
I think I'm hearing three big ideas from the wealth of input over the last couple of hours. I think the first contextual thing in my mind to reflect on is that this Kairos moment, this what a friend of mine called the Rosa Parks moment, won't be here forever. We will soon be too busy to reflect and to think and to act. And it will be so easy to slide back into the status quo. So I think whatever we're thinking and thinking of doing has to factor that in mind, that we have a moment here, but it's a moment not just to react, but a moment to reconstruct the future in a way which is transformational. And that, I think, is a very important kind of contextual reality for our 2 hours and for future conversations. I think the second big thought in my mind as I hear us discuss is to ask if we have seen new things, and we have over the last 3 weeks, unprecedented levels of reformation in structures being proposed, a new conscientization with our white brothers and sisters around the world, the very powerful recognition, as Dr. Harris reminded us, that there is something about a universality of the inferiority of blackness being revealed and now being recognized in the protests on the street, and that inequality has been recognized not just by black, but by black and white. If that is new in the scenario of anti-racism, what is our new response to the newness we see? Because I think there's very little point in bringing old paradigms to new possibilities. And it seems to me that from a Pentecostal perspective, certainly, and gathering again some of the key thoughts which we've been sharing together, this has to address one of the big defaults and fault lines, I think, which happens in Black theological thinking and Black church experience. And that is that it's not that we have an absence of theological reflection and an orientation towards a Black scholarship and a Black hermeneutic. I think it's there, and we've got, again, players in the room who have provided that for us. I think what is still missing for us in this new setting is that for a lot of Black Pentecostal context, there is a gap between academia and reflection and the pulpit and mobilizing people. And I suspect that one of the things we have to work on quite fast is how we bring that gap together between academic reflection and pastoral and practical application through the didactic processes we have through pastoring, Sunday schools, teaching, all of that. I think there is, until I think we begin to look at that gap, I think we will undermine the perspective and the potential we have to bring about some kind of transformational change. And that gap, as it is reduced, I suspect, the kind of curriculum which needs to go in there is a curriculum about hermeneutics, how we handle the Bible and understand it, how we sanctify the word economics, and realize that there is, if you like, a salvation of economics. And economics has always been important. Economics was what pushed Sam Sharp into his rebellion. Economics, as Eric Williams would say, was what began to undermine the system of slavery, which meant that white folks began to hear it more sympathetically as it became uneconomical to have slaves. So I think we have to do the economics, we have to do the education, and to bring that synergy together between academia and church, where this becomes a natural part of our preaching curriculum and our way of discipling people in order to make them more effective citizens. And perhaps the last of my three key points would be to ask, and this comes back to the context we're talking in here, Dr. Clark, is what is the specific contribution of Black Pentecostalism around the world to addressing this new situation? And I think if we began to deconstruct and reconstruct some of the very bad and inequitable models of justice within the church, whether it's white, whether it's from Asia, whether it's Hispanic, whether it's in Africa. We have a lot of work to do in dismantling our own racism in order to be able to model that. One of the first places I read, Frank, was your book, No Life of My Own. That, for me, demonstrated the homework which Pentecostals have to do in South Africa then and now, as well as around the world. So for me, this feels like a kind of a 3-point summary of a lot of the things we've been talking about and the kind of homework we might have to do.
Thank you so much. Powerful thoughts there. And I love the first point, or the second point. If we are seeing a kind of a change in response with the global and a lot of people have been talking about the fact that, and I've been seeing it, a lot of the people marching and speaking are not Black folks, and banners are saying "End of silence." What then? If this is new, what is our new response? And so I'm going to ask Frank again to respond and reflect on what Dr. Edwards has said, and also if you could give us two things or so that we can do now. What can we do, and what would they be? Is he still? Where is he?
Yes, my mouth is shut. No, I wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this session. It has been very informative because hearing from others, you learn new things that you are not dealing with. I am encouraged by it. I would like to make just 3 proposals in a brief way because I'm aware of the time. I think we need based on what I've heard, new interventions within the churches and theological institutions, starting, of course, from the Pentecostal and beyond. We need to use this moment to intensify those. Work has been done, but we could do more. The second is to intensify the action on initiatives at international platforms, which I've referred to and others have referred to. I mean, if you take the WCC leading to their assembly, there's a lot that can be done there. And the Evangelical Alliance and all other structures, there's a lot that needs to be done between now and then. And then I just want to say that I would like us to have more conversation about this Pan-African conference, because the way it is structured, and it started from the church base, the way it's structured is that every region where there are people of African descent, Latin America, the Caribbeans, North America, Europe, Middle East, etc., and on the African continent, are supposed to do work between now and December, analyze their situation. We don't want to duplicate work. What are the issues they are facing? What are they going to do about them? And then end up saying, what are the things we should do together to end this racist system in the world? Then there is also the issue of commissions on specific themes like, economics, financial markets, this issue that has been referred to about France, for instance, continuing with the colonization of those countries. We want to unpack all that so that we can bring it to the surface and be able to act on it together. And there are various other commissions that we're looking for institutions of research institutions, studies, theological, social, economic, etc., to do the work between now and December, so that during the year next year, we work on the work that comes from different regions. And by the time we go to the conference in October, we would like to have a comprehensive plan of action. Now, you may be hearing this for the first time because it's a new discussion, and would like to engage as many people as we can. And I would like to leave it at that. I must say I learned a lot about this thing, about, the great return you were talking about, which happened last year, the experiences in Ghana. Some of the African Americans, people from the diaspora, ended up in South Africa as well. There is a lot to be done together. Challenges are huge, but we can actually deal with the economic challenges together.
Thank you.
Given, notwithstanding the limitations in terms of capital, resources, etc., we can make a lot of difference.
Thank you so much. Reverend Tamsin Karipo, butchered your name again. Tell us what you think that we could, what are some of the practical things we could do, and pick up the conversation as you've been hearing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Clark. And thank you so much to you and to all the panelists for allowing me to be involved in this discussion with you today, this important discussion. I have 3 things that I think, and I'll just be quick, really based from my own context and my own experience, but potentially it can feed into a more global idea. The first is that the implementation of Indigenous rights, as outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, must be the minimum standard in terms of original international law in our churches, in the structures of our institutions and our theological schools. Our countries, all countries, and all of our institutions need to be held account, as has already been said, for justice to be realized. The second thing, and this also relates particularly for us as Māori, for Indigenous people, is the prioritisation, prioritising the embedding of Mātauranga Māori and Kaupapa Māori, in other words, prioritising embedding Māori ways of knowing and Indigenous values in our governments, institutions, and all of our systems and our churches. A third, and I think this is a very important one too, is for us to have the courage as churches to critique ourselves, to really investigate the aspects of our institutions that continue to perpetuate injustice and inequality in all forms. Racism is symptomatic of a system that privileges the powerful at the expense of those on the margins, so that it is intimately connected with justice issues, such as gender-based violence and the oppression of the poor. We cannot discuss racism without reference to all of these issues. And we cannot, as Christians, as church leaders, discuss racism without recognizing and challenging our own complicity in and benefiting from unjust systems, the global economic system, and even the injustices inherent in the hierarchies and power structures of many of our churches and theological institutions. How do we, the church, perpetuate the oppression we stand so strongly against? Where and how do we fail to recognize the image of God in our brothers and sisters? Where do we fail to see the treasure? Where do we fail to stand? This is both a challenge and, I think, a way forward. Collaboration, discussions like this, and a broad perspective, I think, is needed and is the only way forward towards racial justice and equality. So just a few thoughts there.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I'm going to join now Dr. Hopkins. I'll be interested in what you think could be some of the steps we can take. As Joel was talking about, we have this Rosa Parks moment, this Kairos moment. I would also be interested to think of to get your input on this idea that Dr. Edwards raised, in that if we are seeing something shift and change with the white Caucasians, particularly millennials, taking upon the challenge of speaking out about racism, if there's a change, in what way should there be a change in the way we respond, or should we be doing the same kind of rhetoric? Does it make a difference what we're seeing in the way we respond to that? That was just something that you can, if you have time, you can throw in. But yeah, any sort of practical steps that we can lean into this Kairos moment right now, before the wind of change and before we get busy in the future.
Yes, just briefly. First of all, again, thanks for including me. It's such a humbling experience, all these heavyweights here. Really learned a lot and enjoyed the process and hope to be part of whatever happens. Just three things. Hopefully, if we were or are to continue, I hope, one, that we're able to come to some consensus on a biblical foundation for what we do as the first thing. And I still think that, Exodus 3 is important. I still think that Luke chapter 4 is important. Spirit of the Lord has appointed me. I think Acts 2 and 4 are important still. I think Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. So those are my input if I were to ask to be part of the conversation on what's the biblical foundation. Two, after the biblical foundation, I think it's important to narrow in who are the Black people in the Black community we're talking about. And again, to me, it's those people who won't get the national platform, like those of us who benefited from the civil rights movement, Black Power movement, who are professionals, and we don't have food deserts. So just important to focus on, again, I'm talking the U.S. context and Southside Chicago context, that that I keep my memory and focus on those people. And thirdly, I think that Black pastors, American citizen Black pastors, every year in December should have an accounting, and primarily, and also the Black theologians. It has to be both. How many Black businesses did we help build in the last 12 months? How many Black jobs did we create? How many Black scholars, how many Black students got into college? How many HBCSUs did we help? I think that would be the third thing, is for us to be accountable to the gospel, which is the first suggestion, and accountable to those little ones, which is my second suggestion. Thank you very much.
Dr. Herbert, thank you so much, Dr. Hopkins, for that. And you talked about what could be next. Yes, we could think about maybe whether we could write something or whatever. We'll look into that. But Dr. Herbert, what are your thoughts?
Okay, thanks again for, it's been really amazing. I've been sending messages to people, I want to speak to you after this. But for me, again, I said it earlier, and I'll say it again, I think that there is a space for people to be speaking across the board, across the pond, globally, and there are many conversations happening. But there was a point made earlier about the millennials and young people. So while all of that activity is going on, there are young people that need our support. The church, obviously, as I said earlier, is a resource. There are professionals in there that can support young people because they are traumatized and they are struggling and suffering no more than no less than us. Because you see a 6-foot-odd man being murdered in broad daylight, and you're looking on, and then you wonder who is there to protect me. Well, we look to the church, we look to those that have a bigger voice. And so if you have voice, then use it. And if you have skills, then use those too, because it's right across the board. So you do things at a high level, have the conferences, have the conversations, but you have to act. Faith without works is dead. So my final would be to do something. Do something. Every little bit will help come together and do something.
Thank you so much. Mark Sturge, Dr. Reverend Sturge, what do you think? What are some of the things we could do?
One of the things I think that needs to happen is for the church that has a responsibility need to, in the same way that you do a skills audit, to do an audit of their responsibility. What is our ability to respond to these key issues that happen, whether in our communities, to our members, or the things that society is crying out for? What is our responsibility to those things? And tool up to make sure that they can respond and live according to the responsibilities that they have. One of the challenges you might find with Black majority churches in this context is that they also need to become students of the issue of justice in order for them to become accompaniers to white Christians and their congregations as they navigate this process. So there shouldn't be any shame in saying, I need to learn and learn fast and really tool up very quickly. The other thing I think that could be helpful, this is for the church to benefit itself. In the 1980s, the church lost a whole generation of young people because it was less responsive than it ought to be. This is an opportunity to actually regain the credibility lost, or some of the credibility lost, with a new generation of young people by standing with them, by telling them, I hear you, I see you, I feel your pain, and I am with you in the journeys that you're traveling as you work out, as we work together, the issues that we have. The one other thing I would say, I went back to my theological institution the other day and I said to them, you guys let me down. I spent 3 years of my time with you and not one lecture taught me about justice. And now the job I'm doing, everywhere I turn in scripture, I see justice. There is something fundamentally wrong with theological formation. And if you're going to deal with the issues of economics, the issue of just about spiritual formation, the people you choose to be leaders, if you choose them only on their spirituality as you perceive it to be, then you're not creating the kinds of leaders who are required for the task of leading communities and leading people to better futures. Yes, you take care of the spirit and the soul, which is great, but as we see every day, people need more. You go to hospital because you're sick. Why are people coming to the church? And why are people coming? To hear you as a leader speak into their lives and into their situation. And we have to work that out well.
Do you have any thoughts of how can what happens in South Africa, in New Zealand, in America, in UK, in Europe, injustice, any thoughts about galvanizing that international consciousness? Are there any sort of practical things that, if there was one thing you could say that we could do to lean into that, what would that be?
So here's our clotted history in terms of, I start with, we used to have the Center for Black and White Partnership, the African and Caribbean Evangelical Alliance doing work between Black and White. And most of those instruments are now gone. The churches need to have its own instrument, which provides an authentic voice with confidence and conviction that speaks their truth to power, to the powerful, and to where they need to do some deconstruction. That entity exists in some ways in the Black Church Leaders Forum, but it is unresourced and it's used expediently. So it is not the voice that it ought to be to help to solve some of these problems.
Right, thank you so much. That's very, very useful. Dr. Harris, what are your thoughts on particularly how we can strengthen global coalitions around actions towards justice? Is he still with us?
I don't think he's here, Joe. Clifton.
He's not here. Okay. So let me move to, is Dr. I know it's been a long time, Dr. Laporta. Let me hear from you. What are some of the things that you think we could do? You're in South Africa, I'm in the US, we have people in England and New Zealand. Is there anything that we can do to kind of strengthen each other in terms of our local and national fights for justice?
From what I have heard in terms of the hermeneutics and the theology and the Bible, it is important for us to reaffirm again the holistic approach to being Christian, that we don't have the luxury of choosing mercy against justice. Mercy and justice are inseparable, and it's part and parcel of the same responsibility that has been given to the church in the world today and for the future. So I think we need to reaffirm and reassure people it is not wrong to speak about issues of economics, with the same passion we speak about issues of being saved or souls. It is important for us to understand issues of justice, issues of righteousness goes together. And that is what I think is important for us all to understand, to get the clear view of where we are and what we want to do, and that God is a God of justice and mercy.
Thank you so much. We have a question here from one of the audience that we can think about. And as you go through, if you can think about this, can we please confirm what an intervention framework should represent within the immediate, medium, and long term? So not just now, but what are some of the immediate, medium, and long term framework that could be looking like? Let me move to Dawn. Anybody before we move to that can quickly in a few seconds speak to that question. Doctor.
This is Dr. Albert. If that's okay, I would like to respond to that.
Okay.
Continual dialogue is very important as one of the strategies for sharing knowledge sharing strategies. Part of the challenge that we have faced in the divide between especially white communities, churches, and African American churches is the lack of proper dialogue. So some white leaders, evangelical white leaders, will tell you they don't think racism exists. So this should be a short-term and a long-term strategy to always have continual dialogue. What kind? Well, we can do stuff like once in a month brown bag luncheon, where community leaders come together and focus on key issues. And, where racism is one of it, but it doesn't just have to be the sole reason. But the point is, when that conversation, that continual dialogue starts, people become more comfortable in opening up to learn and begin to accept strategies by which they can collaboratively work to solve these problems at a local level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dawn Lewinson, can you share with us what what are some of the strategies that you think we could come to? And if you could also highlight some questions that we may need to address as well.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, just quickly, I think that the whole issue of education, be it within the church, be it with our people, our own people of colour, and a re-education in terms of our thinking about where we are and how we are. I've seen this through my children currently with this Kairos moment of a new learning and a new understanding. And I think that continuing with this is really important. So education, but there's something around the economic situation that needs to be addressed, and I don't know what the answer is, but the disparity between our understanding of the way in which colonies were compensated and the contracts that they had and how they are still benefiting, and our mother country is losing out, and all people of colour across the globe are experiencing this. There's something about doing something around the economics, but I haven't got an answer. I don't know whether it's long-term, short-term, or it's an ongoing thing that needs to be addressed. But they're the two things that I think are important.
All right. I think, did I see that Dr. Joel Edwards has to leave us? Is that right? Any parting comments before you leave? We're going to be closing in about 5 minutes.
No, I just think it's been such a rich conversation, and I look forward to seeing what the container looks like to take us forward in the future. But thank you. It's been a very, very rich time. And I'm glad I agitated the meeting.
Thank you so much. God bless you. Okay, Dr. Gayton.
Clifton, can I just say something on that question that you just asked?
Okay, go ahead. Quickly.
I think one of the things we need to avoid in this season,
feel free to bow.
There'll be lots of calls for us to be co-opted into stuff. And we need to avoid becoming co-opted and becoming what I call the Dalmatians. So you're just a black spot in the box, rather than an inclusion model which revisits what the objectives are that people are seeking to do and come up with objectives that also meet my needs and my aspirations. And it's an important part of the conversation that we empower ourselves to say, if I'm going to join you, I'm coming to live in this situation. Therefore, it needs to be able to be sufficient for my needs. And the other thing I think we need to do is to enable our churches and our members to do some skills management. By that I mean, we have people who are teaching Sunday schools, speaking on a regular basis in church. How do you translate those skills and capabilities that you have, that you've developed over the years, so that you can put it as employment capabilities and competencies? What people tend to do is to hide their faith. So the things that they do in church, they leave it aside. So as a recruiter, when I see certain things, I know what somebody has, and you're able to tease it out. Whereas if they go into a different context, those things have no value, no weight. So we need to be able to help people to use those capabilities to enhance their competencies as they present themselves in the workplace as well.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gayton, give us your final words. Van Gayton, are you still here? I think he's gone.
Yeah, he's gone.
Okay, he's gone. Okay, so I think any last, just before you go, just quickly, are there any pressing questions that we have not really addressed, Dawn, on the question, inequality of opportunity is a major problem? I don't think there's any colonialism issues. Okay, I think we addressed most of these questions. Well, I want to say, okay,
Can I just say just very quickly that while we're all, I mean, I'm probably one of the youngest ones here, young people are not in the room. And, you know, young voices need to be heard. And so, you know, as I said earlier when I spoke that, you know, the adults are there and the young people are falling off into custody, etc. And so while we have these conversations and we talk about those that are less able or etc., the young people, our young people, we need to give them voice. And now I'll shut my voice.
No, good. In fact, last week we had a millennial conversation but it was not. It was more of a national across the US. I think maybe UK involved, but that was a millennial conversation. But it will be interesting to see what a sort of international millennial or international youth conversation would look like. Now, just in closing, and let me just say thank you so much for hanging out and leaning into this. It's possible we could think about, in terms of, one of the things that we could do is to document our thoughts. And I'd be interested to see how many of you would like to, if we were going to do a sort of an edited volume, whether that will be of any use, and whether or not anybody will be interested in contributing your thoughts to what global justice looks like from our local and to our national, in the various spheres that we've been talking about. And so that's one of the things we could do. But and also I would hope that with the email that we have, that you'll begin to talk to each other. I think there are some things that came out that I've seen others who are working in areas such as Pentecostalism. I'm involved in sort of curating and nurturing a Black Pentecostal, a global Black Pentecostal theological tradition, and how that can lead into issues of justice from a Pentecostal perspective and theology. And so I encourage you, some of you are in training, and that we can begin to learn and lean into these issues so much more as we move forward. So thank you so much. It's been a long time. We've been on nearly 3 hours. You've been patient, and thank you so much for your thoughts. And we're going to air this on the internet, on YouTube and different places, so people can listen to it. And I'll send you all the link. But thank you so much, and I look forward to meeting you or speaking to you again pretty soon. Take care.
And just before we go, I just want to thank Dr. Clark.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay. for gathering us all together and bringing us together, and so we could share our various perspectives and views. So thank you, Dr. Clark, for doing this. All right. Thank you.
And before you go,
okay,
can I also say that we should end with a prayer?
Sure.
And so I would just go ahead and say, Father, we thank you for all that has been shared. We pray for your divine wisdom and direction, energies that we need to implement that which has been said. We pray, oh God, that you will lead us and make all things work for your good in Christ Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Hallelujah. Amen.
God bless you. God bless everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much, Don. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very, very much.